It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm very honoured. I'm also joined by Gary Forbes from our offshore division, and you should take that as an indication that HMRC will support the all-island efforts to prevent money laundering that impacts both the Isle of Man and the United Kingdom. I'm going to try and cover a quite ambitious agenda today. I've spent the first 15 years of my career investigating smugglers, smuggling things, firearms, controlled drugs, and things including alcohol and so on that have tax on them. So I kind of understand the structure of organised crime and how organised crime generate money. And I've spent the last 15 years solely concentrating on professional money laundering networks. We're going to talk briefly about the money laundering process, the structure of a particular type of prevalent money laundering network, criminal decision making, and I'm going to touch on fintech and crypto. We're then going to talk very briefly about some of the challenges that we all face, and hopefully I'm going to leave you with some hope about how we manage risk. I think this is perhaps the main takeaway I want you to have. We need to think differently when we're dealing with international money laundering networks. So think differently about everything, in fact, not just money. What we're up against. So, why would someone need to use a professional money laundering network? So the biggest crime group in Europe are the 'Ndrangheta Mafia, based in Calabria, southern Italy, apparently worth 50 billion euros. At the time that estimate was made, 50 billion euros was 3% of Italy's GDP. According to the National Crime Agency, they reckon hundreds of billions are laundered in the UK. That is a significant amount of money and therefore a significant risk. People should be familiar with the money laundering process. Three main ways, simply put, through the financial system or the physical movement of things, money, cash smuggling, or goods. If you use goods, it may have a tax consequence. People frequently refer to what I describe as the PLI model, placement, layering, and integration. In my experience, however, that is not how money is laundered. In my experience, criminals raise, use, store, and move criminal proceeds. In fact, the money laundering process starts before the money is raised, because if it doesn't, you're probably going to get arrested very swiftly. So before I offend everybody in the room, it may involve placement, layering, integration. I'll give an example. If the 'Ndrangheta Mafia want to buy more drugs, they may in fact simply smuggle the money to South America. There's no placement of those funds in the financial system because the cash has simply been smuggled. There's also no integration of that money in the financial system necessarily, although there may be if a drug dealer decides to buy a Ferrari or some other high-priced item. So you can see that the placement, layering, and integration model is outdated, in my view. So I'm going to talk about international controller networks. They are probably the most prevalent form of professional money laundering network that we see. What do? They can collect cash in one jurisdiction and make the equivalent value available in another. So, for example, you could give them £100,000 in cash in London, and the money could arrive in the Isle of Man in form of artwork, for example, or maybe crypto. These organizations are crime groups that are providing money laundering as a service. This is the concept of cash pooling, where in order to be a controller, you need to control about $200 million of assets globally, because when someone asks you, can you launder money, the answer must always be yes. So they operate by having coordinators in every jurisdiction that they need to move money. So this is a brief structure of a controller network, and what we tend to see is coordinators. We don't tend to see controllers. Controllers are almost now exclusively based overseas. I'll come on to why later. I'm going to focus today on money transmitters. In terms of collectors, we see much comment about the use of money muling in money laundering, and I call these people collectors. They collect cash for professional money launderers and may introduce it into the financial system by operating a mule account, for example. There's been much talk about the use and abuse of electronic money institutions and other non-bank payment service providers in the UK. And certainly since the NRA in 2020 to now, the NRA published in July this year, there's been a recognition that the risk has gone up. That risk actually has risen exponentially along with the payment volume. The UK has the biggest non-bank payment sector globally, and as you can see, previously less than $1 trillion was moved, and now it's more than 2 trillion. So pausing very briefly on that amount, these are non-bank payment service providers that are not regulated in the same way banks, and globally they're moving 2 trillion. That's more than the entire amount of crypto dealing in the UK. Much, much more. So, I have seen criminal infiltration into this sector. It's extremely high risk, hence the new definition in the NRA. So, who or what is a professional money laundering network? What do they do? What does it look like? So, they provide companies as a service. They provide accounts as a service. They provide people as a service. Why do you need people? Well, you need people to collect cash for you. You need people to act as nominee directors of companies for you. And you need people to act and operate mule accounts. All of these things can be provided by professional money laundering networks. They can provide front companies and introduce funding into those companies. They can help you covertly acquire real estate property anywhere globally. They will help you abuse the relationship with the bank so that the bank do not know you exist. I'll unpack that later. They can provide access to and accounts with electronic money institutions or any other payment provider, unregulated electronic money distributors, perhaps a lawful money service business that's an agent for one of the brand name operators. Clearly now, more so, crypto, because criminals now apparently enjoy the use of crypto. I've also seen what I describe as abuse of post office services, where criminal networks will introduce cash into the financial system via the post office. We also see the use of payment cards provided to individuals so they can spend either lifestyle expenditure or other purchases in order to engage in tax fraud or any other activity, lawful or otherwise. All of these things can be provided by professional money laundering networks. But the interesting thing about the three things at the bottom, they are simply keys to access the services above. So you'll need a card before depositing cash into the post office, but all of these things can be provided to you covertly. So Matt Tuzel from the FSA, who's with us today, we worked on this investigation together. This is the Met Police's Operation Stormhold. The Met Police investigated the Cali Colombian drug cartel, and they recognized that they needed a different approach to undermine their operations. So instead of just giving the intelligence to the drug team, they shared the intelligence with their financial investigators. And they found that Belcastle, who had told the bank that they provided translation services and had a turnover of £5,000 a month, were actually laundering money through the post office by using the post office van service that collected the cash from a network of more than 2,000 money service businesses in the UK. They laundered 1.3 billion in drug money. Now, this is a law enforcement view. This isn't the view of the regulator necessarily at the time. This is a law enforcement view. So how do we understand how these networks operate? So it's about criminal decisions. Firstly, we know that if there's a significant amount of money being generated by a criminal, the first decision the criminal will make is, do I launder the money myself or use a professional? So what does the criminal want to do? And what factors will influence that decision? So the intention of the criminal here is to engage in tax fraud and provide professional money laundering services. We know from our experience investigating those involved in missing trader inter-community fraud, or MTIC for short, they domiciled themselves largely in Dubai. But those people also engaged in professional money laundering because they understood the banking system. So a criminal wants to engage in tax fraud and provide money laundering services. How are they going to do it? So, in order to do it, they need access to the UK and global payment system. How are they going to achieve that? So what they decide to do, for example, is set up an offshore, unregulated electronic money distributor. Why? Because it's harder for the authorities to attack an offshore entity. That firm cannot engage in financial services, so therefore they need to partner with someone who can. They decide to partner with an authorised electronic money institution in the UK. What does that do? That gives them access to a master account at a bank indirectly. They can access that account remotely through an API. The remote access is important because it means they can then be based anywhere in the world. And what we learned is the entity was based in one jurisdiction, the people were physically located elsewhere and in a different jurisdiction. What that then does is give them the ability from the master account to create virtual international bank account numbers, VIBANs, virtual accounts that frankly don't exist. But they do exist, but they don't exist legally. That enabled them to launder 500 million and move 2.5 billion. So, I said previously about international controllers based mainly overseas, and this is because of their use of particular high-AD secured device service called EncroChat that you may well have been aware of, that offers end-to-end encryption. There was a documentary recently, and if you saw it, you'll understand. It gave law enforcement access in real time to criminal conversations, but it gave us unprecedented insight into how professional money laundering networks operated. So it's a simple diagram that explains how one professional money laundering operation, one money laundering organisation operated. You had initially an authorized electronic money institution that was corrupt, but their criminal clients wanted crypto. So they delivered their crypto by accepting cash, by a street cash handover, and then accepting an electronic transfer from a bank account into the electronic money institution. They then transferred the money to a crypto broker, who then transferred the money to an offshore crypto broker. And in 4 months, they were able to launder 100 millions of tax fraud proceeds. But all of these institutions were based in a different jurisdiction, and the bank had no knowledge at all of what was going on. This firm is no longer registered. A slightly more complex picture. You start with the unregulated electronic money distributor offshore. And once again, this is a law enforcement view, having issued court orders. This is not the bank view. We'll come on to the bank view momentarily. So the corrupt professional money laundering network has an offshore unregulated electronic money distributor. As I've said, they have an account with an authorized electronic money institution, and that firm has 3 bank accounts. So the money held by, frankly, the criminal is distributed in 4 different financial institutions. This is purely a sterling to sterling operation. What we discovered is, in a separate investigation, at point 5, we learned that they were sending money because they wanted crypto through a second authorized electronic money institution via an intermediary in Singapore, and the money landed up in a Chinese underground banking network held in an account at Silvergate Bank. You may be aware of Silvergate Bank. They are the bank for FTX, which obviously most people will be aware of, that collapsed. But the firm was brass plaqued in Delaware, but physically operating in Chinatown in Chicago. And that concept of brass placking is something that we frequently see in money laundering schemes, where, for example, you may have a firm based in London, physically, but yet is incorporated in the Isle of Man, for example, but doesn't visit the Isle of Man and has no physical presence in the Isle of Man, for example, and may also then have an entity in the free zone, typically Dubai. So you may look at a scenario where the physical operation is in London with incorporation elsewhere. It's tricky. So this is the bank view. The bank are aware that their electronic money institution customer has about 10,000 companies as clients and is operating about 10,000 FIBANs. The bank are aware of that from their compliance check. The bank will issue a master account. The EMI will issue 10,000 FIBANs. Actually, the EMI didn't issue 10,000 FIBANs. The FIBANs were issued by the unregulated electronic money distributor. The bank are not aware of that. But we know from the previous slide that is actually what happened. But why is 10,000 significant? So we've got a crime group that controls 10,000 accounts. We know, don't we, that the normal suspicious transaction report threshold is about 10,000 currency units. And obviously 10,000 companies doing 10,000 transactions adds up to 100 million. So very easily, very quickly, transactions that do not appear to be suspicious can be moved swiftly at a click of a button. We know from the previous example, this scenario was corrupted by a professional money laundering network who was sending instructions to the electronic money institution for payments to be executed by the bank. But of course, the bank are not cited on what happened. is extremely highly problematic. So if we look at the complexity of international crime groups and the challenge of crime groups operating in different jurisdictions, they're very resilient to law enforcement intervention. We have an issue where firms will locate, as I've said, in one jurisdiction because they want to operate freely. So they prefer operating in jurisdictions where we would describe them as having weaker AML responses. This is a challenge for us. The concept of follow the money is tricky. How can you follow the money in that previous example where the bank are unsighted on its customer? And of course, there's no requirement for a bank to do customer due diligence on its customer's customer. But the use of a third party to make payments on your behalf inevitably means that it will be almost impossible in most instances to follow the money. And how can you follow the money that's been placed into the financial system in one country in cash, that's then transferred electronically, held in an electronic money institution, which is then transferred into another jurisdiction and is now held in a crypto wallet? They then use a mixer or do what we call a double mix. You cannot follow the money. It's one of the biggest challenges we have and we face as law enforcement and regulators. They use end-to-end encryption. WhatsApp is a favorite, for example. It's been end-to-end encrypted since April 2016. Telegram is favorite. WeChat is not end-to-end encrypted, but one of the challenges is the ability of law enforcement to speak foreign languages, for example, Chinese or Russian, when you're conducting your investigation, to actually understand what's going on. The use of EncroChat and SkyECC platforms, which of course we know have been hacked since, but the fact that they exist as concepts prevails. And as things move more towards blockchain technology, we're going to notice more and more use of blockchain-enabled communications. So what we need to do is not just cyber investigation, we need to do traditional investigation to identify and attribute who is using these services so that we can bring them to book. The use of professional enablers, of course, is widespread. That means that the crime group has access to greater knowledge than the people investigating them quite often, and technically greater expertise. But we need to consider a blended response. We certainly do our best in HMRC to do both civil and parallel criminal investigations. But if we look at fintech and crypto as a thing, like I said, we also need to do cyber investigations. We need to do traditional investigations, but we need to work out which approach to use in which circumstances. But they are significant challenges when you consider the offshore nature of things, the Internet of Things, the fact that different jurisdictions have different AML responses and different laws. So this is the part of the HMRC that I work in, and we tackle the most serious high harm cases. We call this organised crime pyramid. Gary and myself, we operate at the end there where we deal with the organised crime response, but most of our work is done by disrupting organised crime using our general compliance powers. We have about more than 320,000 civil compliance investigations currently, but within the Fraud Investigation Service, we have about 11,000. So you can see that our targeted response to organised crime is deliberate. Where possible and where necessary, we will investigate and prosecute, and we currently have a success rate of 91%. So you can see there are times when the only way that you can disrupt organised crime is to use criminal enforcement powers and our covert capability. But we do, of course, majorly use our civil powers. So key takeaways, like I said, it's extremely unclear on how professional money laundering networks operate. It's unclear and challenging So we need to think maybe outside the box, I think is the expression that most people use. We need to think differently about how we're going to tackle our non-bank payment service providers that are using circuitous methods to obtain access to banking indirectly. So, criminal decision-making drives behaviour. If you're familiar with red teaming or blue teaming, it's actually fun. You put yourself in the mind's eye of a criminal and you ask yourself, how would I do it if I was a criminal so that I don't get arrested and the authorities are not aware of what I'm doing and cannot stop what I'm doing? So as I've said, we should consider the raise, store, use, move method of the money laundering process rather than simply concentrating on perhaps more outdated concepts. And we need to think about the fact that certain jurisdictions are less friendly. We learned earlier, didn't we? Some have a weaker AML response. And that provides us with significant challenges when we're perhaps issuing papers. Do we go to a jurisdiction where we think that there may be issues with corruption, for example? How do we deal with that conundrum when we've got crime groups operating in those areas? And what is our response? I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was hugely thought-provoking. And in particular, I think the idea of abandoning that traditional linear model of placement, layering, and integration, because it's not a sequence anymore, is it? It's so multifaceted and quick.
Yeah, I think the Internet of Things means that we've got slightly more challenges. But you also need to consider that not everyone wants to introduce funds into the financial sector, which is, of course, the placement stage. And sometimes the best way not to get caught is to not introduce those funds into the financial sector. So the question might be, how do we investigate the people that are keeping money away from the authorities, which includes, of course, the obliged entities?
So we do have a coffee break schedule, but we've got some great questions on Slido. So I'm going to take a couple of questions, if that's okay with you, DQ, and then no pressure, and then we'll go and grab some coffee, if that's all right. So, I think the thing that really intrigued me was that professionalization of money laundering as a service. This end-to-end delivery of whatever you need to launder your money. And there's a question: when a network supplies people, say nominee directors, do they know themselves? Are they complicit as part of that laundering process?
It's tricky. I think what I observe is the money laundering crime groups infiltrating the sector and operating firms themselves. In instances where they're unable to do that, they will use an unwitting participant. And one of the biggest challenges for the financial sector is to learn when they themselves are being abused.
And a really relevant question, one that probably lots of us are thinking about in terms of the context of AI and that rapid growth. So, are you seeing criminals' use of AI and automation in your investigations? And if not, do you think they are going to start using it?
Man versus machine. I think my view on it, it's not necessarily HMRC's view. We of course support and welcome digital innovation, but I think you need to consider the human response. The AI, of course, will deal with what it already knows. Quite frankly, as I've said with the EncroChat hack, we learned more from that hack as to how criminals did what they did. So you can't use AI on a process that you are utterly unaware of.
And I think certainly from an Isle of Man perspective, the EncroChat taught us a lot about the criminality that's trying to target the Isle of Man in terms of its sophistication, its ruthlessness, and its ability to pivot quickly to meet responses from law enforcement.
Yeah, they're very resilient in my experience. And, a center of gravity for a professional money laundering network is their reputation. So they know that if they're providing money laundering services for serious criminals, they need to always say yes. Can you move this money? Yes. So therefore, if a part of their organization is disrupted, they will immediately be looking to how they can counter that response from the authorities. So in my experience, they're very, very resilient.
And finally, that definition of overseas you talked about, the regulatory arbitrage, somebody has quite pointedly asked, are we talking jurisdictions with poorer, weaker AML frameworks or those equivalent to us?
The challenge with regulatory arbitrage is not simply necessarily a jurisdiction that it is poor or has a poor response. It might be, for example, how widespread that that regime is. If we take one of our biggest merchant acquiring organizations in the UK, they are not required to register and become authorized in the United States. So therefore, if you're a professional money laundering network, what you might decide to do is use the services of a firm that's not an obliged entity, because it makes it easier for you to operate covertly. And it's that point that in the investigation that we've just conducted, there is no requirement for that electronic money distributor to register anywhere.
It really is an arms race. Listen, I think we've held you long enough, DQ. Thank you so much. Please, thank you.